What I'll do is I'll just start off with one or two questions of my own, because of course, you know, I have my own perhaps interpretation, if there is, you know, any sort of multiple interpretations of the film, but I'm sure you all also have your own questions. I mean, I myself, for those of you who don't know me so well, am a teacher in communications and new media, and I teach mostly sort of humanistic kind of topics, so things to do with media and representation, the interpretation of text and visuals in general. So from my perspective, from my academic background, this is an extremely interesting film, and one could very easily write a very interesting analysis of the film as such, the way it performs itself as a documentary, but also the actual footage that is incorporated in there. And I think what for me is particularly interesting in that sense of the film is that it in a sense works on two levels, I think. To what extent some of that is intentional or not, that we can go into, but I think on the one hand, the film has a very interesting sort of, if you will, surface narrative of trying to uncover some alternative stories or histories or some alternative facts. So, and it does that very nicely, showing fragments that I've lived in Singapore for 10 years, but definitely showing fragments of things that I had never heard about, and you know, perspectives that I hadn't heard about before. So there are all these allusions to what it means to make a documentary, and there's these parallels being drawn inside the film to, for instance, archaeology, obviously, like, you know, from the beginning and the end is couched in this archaeological narrative, sort of likening the making of a documentary like this to uncovering or digging up certain facts or artifacts, digging up a different kind of truth or a different kind of interpretation of the past. Archaeology, but also Ivan Polunin's attempts are very interesting. The way, you know, at the same time how he's narrating why he shot certain footage, but also the way in which he seems so eager to preserve parts of that past, to preserve even what is in his brain, like unload his brain into the machine, he says at some point. Yeah. Kind of difficult or frustrating, perhaps sometimes, also interesting attempts to uncover an alternative past and to uncover certain facts and to make sense of that. But we all sort of left at the end, and that's why I like the end footage of the archaeologists very much. We have like a box with bits and pieces of fragments. And now what? Well, what are we to make of this? How can we sort of understand this differently than sort of the dominant story that we hear about Singapore and so the building of the nation, what have you? Did you have any kind of sense of, for yourself, that by showing certain fragments, if you will, that for you it adds up to a critique of dominant history of Singapore or how society functions today? Or
I think that's a subtext. I wanted to give the sense that what we know today could possibly live and die by us, like we're the last person to know this particular fact that would in a way change the whole of history. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting that you mentioned the stash of photographs, because for him, as far as he was concerned with a group of his friends, that stash of photographs has never been seen publicly before. Mm-hmm. And as far as he's concerned, it would change the whole writing of all the textbooks. Mm-hmm. So for each of the different people that I have featured, they were, in a way, the last man standing for their particular way of seeing. Mm-hmm. So even the Japanese reporter, she will bear witness, so she almost feels duty bound. There's no other way but to write the article. But of course she has to couch the article that would be palatable to a Japanese audience. And you sort of see the burden of this knowledge for all these different people. You know, Ivan Polunin is struggling to remember, because as far as he's concerned, he's the last person that saw the image. And if he doesn't remember, it's all going to be, you know, YouTube detritus floating around. So I was very lucky to actually find or stumble upon all these different people who in their own way feel almost duty bound to speak and publish in one way or other. Even Marjorie Doggett, she was really just a housewife, really. But as far as she was concerned, if she didn't go out with her camera and tripod to actually hunt down these buildings that were demolished this is in the 50s, mind you, so actually the way history doesn't stop. You would not know what RI used to look like. You know, YMCA, I don't know how many of you actually remember these buildings. YMCA building at Ras Pasar, you know, the old CHIJ in the town convent in Victoria Street, and some of the go-downs in Mohammed Sultan Road. But it leads to the larger question that if these are all the gaps that vest within these singular personalities, then what other gaps are there left? And what does that behove us, you know, this generation of Singaporeans to do to actually work to preserve? That's why the archaeologists were in a way inseparable from this documentary, because they personify the whole process, you actually back-breaking work of remembering, of finding, of recording. And as you kind of like scramble through these bits and pieces, you actually have no idea of its significance. And the amount of effort it takes to sort of make sense of a Yeo Hiap Seng bottle, much less to even find it, you know, what does that actually mean for us? It needed to feature that many number of people in that fragmented a way to make its point.
Yeah.
And some stories are more complete than others. And I suppose that is the nature of the continual process of coming to terms with one's own story, I suppose.
Right.
I mean, there are slightly more arched sections, for example, you know, the bit where suddenly no image, you see no image. That was my way of putting you in the situation of trying to imagine what those images that he was describing is lost. And all you left is his voice, describing what you cannot see, and that sometimes happens. All you left are soundtracks, because they survive a little bit longer on magnetic tape. And meanwhile, you know, the 16mm might have been set on fire. And so it was quite interesting that all I saw a little piddly fire extinguisher in his basement. Film is an extremely flammable, you know, and it lets out all kinds of fumes that are extremely combustible. And all you have sort of holding back the flames is this little kitchen fire extinguisher. Yeah.
And you were talking about these people feeling almost a sense of duty or some kind of urge to somehow have their memories recorded or whatever. It's somehow, you know, to preserve or bring to light to some extent, in a palatable way for some of them, a different kind of story. Do you, when making this documentary, do you have that sense of urgency yourself?
I think this is also partly autobiographical in that way. I mean, when Ivan Pulon talks about his work and why he's doing what he does, it could very well be me.
Right. Yeah.
Like why does one make film? So these are some of the questions that I ask myself, like why am I breaking my back trying to do what I do?
Yeah.
And I suppose it's a way of finding inspiration in the works of other people. Not necessarily filmmakers themselves, but they could be, you know, archaeologists or journalists or historians, you know, doing their own area of studies.
I know your much earlier movie, like Moving House, for instance, is a very sort of edited, you know, sort of, I wouldn't say glitzy, right, but much more coherent kind of narrative. Whereas this one is much more fragmented, like you say, with gaps. There's no voiceover by you or by any narrator. So were those also kind of conscious choices in a way? Or did you feel like you wouldn't want to impose your own narrative per se, even though you are the one who's making the film?
I don't know, it is a struggle, sort of make it really very easy and palatable, but in a way, I'm going for depth. I'm hoping that all your experiences would be a bit more memorable for having seen it the way it is, and that, you know, on a balance, this is a slightly more enduring experience. It's very interesting because this was made in 2007, and I'm suddenly realizing that the pace of editing is very, very slow.
I've seen slow.
Yeah, but you know, and I'm just wondering if you actually see it from a really small hand phone or an iPad, it will not sustain that experience. Maybe there is a case for making films for different devices at different pace, so that they reach different audiences.
So there's something about the technology through which you see the film, obviously, as well.
And it feeds both ways, attention spans, technology. I mean, this is the way that you're watching the film right now, which is on a big screen with sharing it with other people, is going to be a really exclusive experience, you know, moving forward. So does that mean that level of engagement would no longer be a common one in time to come?
When people just individually see it on separate screens.
On really small separate screens.
Yeah. So memory also is built on by virtue of suppressing other aspects of that memory, or forgetting certain aspects. And again, in the film, it seems to suggest that film equally does that. It suggests to me, in a sense, that the technique or technology of preservation is very visual. It's also quite auditory, but you know, otherwise, of course, images, one doesn't touch it. It is not in the same context or experienced in the same context as, you know, for instance, the archaeologist who goes to the site and you ask, why are you taking these bits out of the soil and putting them somewhere else? Why not just leave them there?
Yeah.
And so filmmaking seems to have a similar kind of technique, I suppose. One shoots images and they will be screened somewhere else.
Yes.
And it's no longer in that particular context. So in a certain sense, there must have been, apart from this kind of unconscious or unintentional kind of selection and forgetting that the technology already does for you, have there also been very clearly certain parts that you edited out of this film? Because you said, okay, there are these few people, this is kind of footage. At some point, Boluna says, well, you've been for 2.5 hours here filming and you only get like one sentence out of me. So how is the choice made to show, even if it's slowly edited, those parts?
Everything had to be coherent, so anything that was extraneous had to be taken out.
But how did you decide what is extraneous?
I mean,
in relation to what exactly?
In relation to, everyone had to have something that they wanted to save very, very dearly. Yeah, that you can see them physically trying to remember, preserve, spread news about certain points of view. So I just followed their journey.
So part of your intention was also to show the struggle.
Yes,
to remember.
Yes, entirely.
Yeah.
I mean, the struggle is central.
Yeah. Right.
To this whole film.
Right. Yeah.
So I do agree with Dr. Ingrid that it's very self-reflexive, and it seems rather there's a very deliberate rawness in the experience of the film that somehow when I watch it, and I was wondering, was there any reason why you choose to take out the identification of the characters without identifying them in the film at all until towards the credit?
This was a decision we had to struggle with, whether to actually, I mean, let's say you put the name Marjorie Topley. She's the anthropologist who was speaking Cantonese to the Amajes, whom Ivan Colodin was following. It's different from Marjorie Doggett, who was the photographer. I mean, I think at that point everyone was called Marjorie or something like that. Landed out in the Far East. I was just wondering if, like, we put the name there, say Mr. ABC, whether you needed to put a subtitle which said teacher or doctor or not. And in the end, I just felt that that was extremely troublesome to have to give their title. Because a name like Dr. Ivan Polonin, Associate Professor, Department of Tropical Medicine, hardly gives you an inclination, which was his official title at that time, hardly gives you an idea of what he was doing, which was a lot larger than that. Similarly, you know, Marjorie Doggett, housewife, sometime photographer. It didn't add very much to that experience as well.
When one watches this documentary, you suddenly realize that in other documentaries you're always given the names. and the whatever title or anthropologist or whatever. And so suddenly it strikes one as, in the absence of this information, how do I actually make sense of what is presented to
Because
me?
actually the name actually only makes sense when you give their roles. Because the names themselves are mainly placeholders.
Yeah.
So it was a struggle trying to find a role for them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it makes the text more open in a sense, I think. Yeah.
Why do you choose to use unconventional way of documenting what you wish to put across?
I think for me the camera is just a way of meeting people. So the people that I'm interested in, I just go up to them and talk to them, and I happen to have a camera. So to actually start writing a script and cast actors, I don't find that process rewarding at all. So it's for me like a pen that you just sit down and you write something. So the camera is for me a means to be really busybody.
In this sense, you had, say, 4 or 5 different stories. How did you pick these stories? Did you actually go and meet up with more number of people? How do you decide whom to go meet up with?
It's a very long, tortured process. Because initially this documentary started out as being a documentary about spaces. It had nothing to do with its final form, but I found myself attracted to the work of the archaeologist. So I kind of like followed him around. And when I found that he was doing what he was doing, and I thought 2 years before that I had met Marjorie Doggett and had filmed that footage for no reason other than the fact to meet her. So this Marjorie Doggett footage was shot way before this documentary was even conceived. So, I mean, my process is to just collect a lot of stuff and then at some point try to find a way to join all the dots together. So it is, you can imagine, extremely organic and also time-consuming. So it's not like a grant proposal where you come up with a really neat grant proposal and then you satisfy all the milestones. It's a lot.
Yeah, because I was wondering whether ICS, for instance, had some requests or requirements in relation to.
No, and they had received an application about Singapore spaces, because that was after I'd done Singapore Gaga.
Yeah.
So after I finished the film, I showed them the final product. I said, it's really very different from from the money that you have given me funding for. Do you want to take a look and see if
You want your money back?
you want your money back?
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. And unfortunately, they didn't. They were very happy to have their name attached to this project.
Are there any people you left out that you have footage of?
I have 40 hours of footage.
Oh my goodness. So it must be a lot,
So
right?
only 1
To
hour
left
of
out.
it has made it to the film.
Sounds like a humanities dissertation. Cut like 90% out.
Yeah. What's interesting is I made another film 5 years later of the leftover footage called Snow City, which has totally nothing to do with this film.
Let's go and watch that. Also, what as academics we choose to write up and what we choose to leave out, even if we sometimes pretend to let other people speak. Right? Like our text or maybe also visuals can be sometimes sort of camouflaging the way we actually very much select what we show and what we don't show. You know, so even if we don't intentionally do that, there is always a sense in which the author is always present in the text, even if like the text is one long quotation by whoever you have interviewed. That's what I think, and this is always for me as an academic, is concerns or troubles me very much. Maybe, and one can only, in the end, I suppose, for me, be honest about what is the stamp when, in the end, leaves on the text or the final product. It's an interesting in that sense to hear that, okay, out of 40 hours that you have, there's 1 hour that actually made it into the film. So, you know, and in the end, it's the Chinese, I'm sorry, I forget his name, is saying what Hegel says, when something does not have a reason to exist, then it doesn't exist. But what a curious thing to say in a way, I mean, in the context of this film.
Yeah.
Right? Is it, I'm wondering what
almost
can
as
be
if
said to
it's conceding
exist? Yeah.
defeat almost.
Yeah, I guess it's rationalizing why his story may also exist, and that it's also a reasonable story.
Yeah.
So just because you were filming also the frustration, right, of something like put in like how to preserve this, I cannot, I cannot die without this stuff somehow making it to another audience and living on. The frustration of the machinery, that the bloody microphone doesn't work now, how do I narrate what I want to narrate? And so there's sort of almost a bit of a fight with the machine,
Yes.
in a sense as well.
Mm.
Yeah. So again, it's like you feel that same sense of frustration also, even when you edit out 39 hours, do you feel a sense of regret or worry about what you have left out?
It was such a painful process trying to put this together. I mean, Michelle explains your nicely put deliberate rawness. Actually, it's totally no choice rawness. It's just trying to squeeze and make sense of my own thinking as well.
Hi, I'm Kai Chong. I'm a Singaporean. I was just wondering.
We should all start Q&As with that declaration from now onwards.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether there are things that you hope Singaporean audiences in particular would take away from this film. For instance, this generation of Singaporeans, you all are very obsessed with taking photographs. Should we all be going up now to capture more footages, just so that history for the next generation will be preserved? Yeah. Actually, I have started doing that myself. I took a video footage of lift upgrading, thinking that one day it might be commercially valuable.
Here's what's interesting, Ivan Pullinan has got like 30 hours of very important footage about Singapore, right? Because he's a naturalist and he's a medical person, his interests veer more into our natural history heritage. So there's less of lift upgrading or stuff like that. But he said that, it turns out like 50 years later, the most valuable footage of his, the most that most people wanted to see, is footage in which he had very summarily taken. It was just a Chinatown market scene. What the lady was selling, how the fish was being sold, the haggling process, and of course, what you see here, you see this police car driving by, and then you see all the illegal hawkers running away, right? Then he said that he just happened to be there and just took a little bit of the footage. So of all the 30 hours that he had, that 5-minute market segment was the most lauded. So, I mean, what's interesting for me is like, can we put place bets now? Like, what kind of footage would we take that 50 years from now, our great-grandchildren, our grandchildren would actually stare and stare and stare at it? I've actually sat through all this footage in National Archives, and I'm thinking, boring, 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 boring. Yeah, so, I mean, that's quite... It was actually the material culture that I found interesting. For example, what the fishermen ate for lunch. For me, it's white rice, sambal you pounded yourself, fresh sambal, and a fish that you probably just caught, which you steamed. I mean, to answer your question, Mohan, I mean, there's one point I forget to mention. I mean, sometimes when I sort of show this video, it's gone around different places to be screened in Singapore. Sometimes I'm asked, why do you highlight the colonials? Why are there no people of other races, for instance? And in the same way you're asking me, what have I deliberately left out, and it's more, the other corollary to that question is, why aren't other people represented as well? And I don't have a smart answer, but the fact that my criteria were my own interests, and the second one was that it had to hold together as a film. So I wasn't going to put something in that didn't belong just because, it would serve the rainbow that Singapore is, or something like that.
If one seeks to narrate sort of alternative stories, to what extent can one actually manage to make it a really alternative story with the materials that are there and the people that have survived? what can one do, I suppose? To what extent can one go?
Right.
Yeah. There's always limitations.
And everyone's dying, right?
Right, another problem. Yeah,
I mean,
very,
I
very
know
big
Roland
problem.
passed away last year and Marjorie Doggett the year before.
Yet interestingly, it doesn't, at least for me as an audience, but maybe it's also because I'm not Singaporean from this region, it does not add up to one narrative.
No.
Yeah, I don't know how that is for other people in the audience.
And it's not meant to be, it's not enough to go on. And I think that was
Yeah.
one of the frustrations of some of the audience as well, because it's like, why don't you make a whole documentary about the Chinese student movement?
Right.
Then I'm like looking at them, I'm like, you want to fun? You fun, I do.
Yeah.
I just thought it was a misplaced indignance, I felt.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see though that some people would want something like that out of a documentary.
No, but why march up to the director to demand, you see, without offering something yourself?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, that's very common to academics too. Why did you do blue and not red? You know, why not purple? Yeah.
When the film is shown in Singapore, I found that people latch onto very specific personalities. When it's actually shown abroad, they catch onto the theme a lot quicker because they're not bogged down by details almost.
Or identification.
Identification,
Yeah.
and it almost feels as if details, you miss the forest for the trees.
And what is that sense of duty or responsibility to record, to preserve, or to show? But this is actually very interesting. It struck me the extent to which Polonen was so, I wouldn't say obsessed, but so hell-bent on leaving
And same with
something
Han
behind.
Sang-yuan as well. I mean, he felt
Yes.
really duty-bound to keep talking, even to really people who have no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah. But for him, it seems there's a very clear politics behind it.
Yes.
Right? I want this alternative story to be heard. They are not violent, what have you. But Polonen, it's more. It seems like it's almost something in
I think
itself.
it's the same germ of. It's probably from the same root. I mean, the intentions are different, but the desire to
Yeah.
might be similar. At least that's what I feel.
Well, there's a very interesting term in continental philosophy. It's called archive fever. They suggest that especially Western culture suffers from archive fever. So wanting to preserve, wanting to record, hence museums, hence ethnographers, hence filmmaking to try to somehow, and of course this kind of idea of preserving or creating archives like museums or colonial museums always also somehow tied to politics and power in terms of former Western empire, for instance. So, in that sense, I suppose it's right that maybe the Chinese fella has a more clear sort of political statement to make. But certainly in the case of Polonen, there is a certain colonial, post-colonial politics going on as well, although he may not be conscious of that. But it seems like it becomes to him sort of a personal thing, like I want to be immortal, but it seems to me that it's more than just that. Yeah. And sort of since the film is so self-reflexive, and you as a documentary filmmaker are sort of engaging with making a documentary and the desire to archive. That's why I'm so interested in your sense of responsibility or duty, or some kind of sense of what was the kind of main points of the film.
I suppose I wanted to show how soft our ground is.
Okay,
I mean,
less metaphor.
facts just seem to be constructed at really, really personal, on the whims of personal desires. If he decided not to take that photograph or show that photograph or remember that particular scene in a certain way, then that one connection to the fact is broken. So
It's like film is also a prosthesis to one's memory.
yes, correct. If that connection is as feeble as it's shown to be. I mean, like, the Japanese journalists had to go through a really crap translator. So already it's so rickety, right? The whole process. So my idea is to actually showcase how rickety everything is.
How rickety our understanding of
Yeah.
facts or stories.
Because it's
Yeah.
so tenuous.
Yeah. Tenuous.
Was there any point that you felt that you might want to consider inserting yourself into this documentary?
I don't think it's necessary more than it already is in.
Why are you asking? what
It's kind
could
of like
be?
to tie into the idea of self-reflexivity, because I mean the film being about documentary making, so by capturing all these documentaries, maybe it also shows your role as a documentaire yourself. So that's why maybe the idea of self-reflexivity you might I don't know, was wondering whether you would consider inserting yourself visually.
I think that technique is overused. And I don't think it's necessary. Because it's there even though you don't see me walking with a camera or something like that. You don't need that anymore. And I think it's overused with a lot of the reality TV type films, TV shows that we have seen. Because every edit you make is already a decision that has a personality behind that.
Yeah.
So you don't need to foreground it anymore. And I think it just becomes distracting as well. It might make it more accessible. It's like, come guys, just follow me.
Yeah. Yeah, and its genre is more recognizable.
I'll show
Like
you.
Say it's so.
Meet some cool friends of mine,
But I also think that would be a problem, because I mean making it more accessible also giving them the in a sense a crutch to understand it.
I
Because
mean, there's a film for every kind of audience. Yeah, I mean, just that this particular film became what it is because the material itself couldn't be bent any other way. I felt at the time, and I didn't feel like anyway. I think that was the main thing.
Yeah.
Didn't feel like making it than what it demanded to be.
Again, I'm referring to my academic experience as an academic. Like one can write very incisive, complicated text, but one knows the audience will be quite small. That one demands a lot from the audience. It's so.
I think writing is a bit different because you can say very, very complex things with very simple language as well. I'm not sure.
Certainly, well, one can do that in academia as well.
Yeah.
But more in the sense of that this particular documentary, for instance, demands a lot from its audience, right? Sort of making sense or sort of not easy, very easy to latch onto one particular
Maybe I should put
identity
it
or
that way,
character.
to say what needed to be said with what I had. This was the best I could come up with. Maybe with more money, more time, better camera work. Because a lot of it was shot by myself. It could have been a little bit less raw, for instance.
After what you said about you have a lot of footage to sort out, but you still chose to use certain shots to link up.
I mean, you know that the DHL balloon is no longer there, right?
Yeah, it's no longer.
That rising shot. And I really love shots where you're elevated and you actually see in real time the 3D effect of, it's kind of like Google Earth, where you can actually just see, but from a hot air balloon. So to capture that particular perspective was quite important to me.
Yeah.
Because it's all about being there at the instant, and in the blink of an eye, that perspective would no longer be there. Because of course a hot air balloon doesn't exist, and even if the building were to be in its stead, you would never get to see the real-time transformation of that landscape before you. Because, I mean, everyone's talking about Singapore. This is the first time we've actually seen, say, the city area, right? Because up until that point, you had only seen, you know, life in the K-Long or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is what it is today.
Today,
Yeah.
yeah, at the 50th minute of the film.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's now yesterday, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's slightly different. Singapore changing so quickly. Yeah.
I invited Mr. Kuo and Dr. Ronin to the premiere. I mean, after that, they still kind of spoke with me, so I guess
They were not angry.
they weren't too angry.
So they felt that they were fairly represented, even though their names and their titles weren't featured.
Oh, actually, there's one part where Dr. Polonin has, in the first edition, Dr. Polonin had said something that he didn't want to leave it with the National Archives because he didn't think very much of them. I had to take that line out. Oops.
There was one part during the film that you cut off the sound of the translator, the Chinese translator who was translating for the Japanese writer. Is there something specific that you're trying to convey? Because there was no sound, you could only see them speaking, or see the Chinese translator speaking.
I suppose that was just a way to sort of lift you out of the film for a while, to just sort of see a scene for what it is without getting bogged down with details. Because in a way, what she said, you already know anyway.
So real quick, would it be fair to say that after such a documentary, you would make subsequent documentaries differently? Does it, like the making of the documentary, did it influence you as a filmmaker?
This was a particularly hard to do piece. It took a really long time for it to come together.
So no more of that for now.
Unfortunately, it doesn't get any easier.
Yeah.
I don't think I learned my lesson.
Who would you list as your key influences for filmmakers?
I actually don't have any. Because I think most of my key influences are not really film directors themselves. Possibly artists, thinkers, writers, maybe.
Singaporean?
Not necessarily.
Hegel?
I haven't made a dent in that yet. I'll read For Beginners. Or Dummy's Guide to Hegel. Actually, I tried to read him to understand what Hans Anya was saying. Yeah.
If there is a social change thematic that you see that has to go into every film that you make, does it have to be explicit or is it implicit? Take Invisible City for an example. Does it work towards social change, explicitly or implicitly?
I think it's one step removed from that, because I don't necessarily feel that film has got such a strong effect on people. Actually, I think very little has. I mean, it's not as if you're going to go out to interview your grandfather about his life story immediately. But I'm hoping that it would just help you think a little bit through our history. And not to take everything at face value. Just because, as I mentioned, everything is just on the weakest of. Everything stands, not necessarily because it needs to stand, but just because, there's enough might behind it to stand.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
Very powerful message that you're trying to send to this generation.
Yes, it is. Yeah. But I mean, for it to effect change, that's why I say it's one step removed.
As humanities academics, we would say, change to the imagination is the most important and profound change one can make.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think the film
So
works
it's just
very
real
well
life
in that sense.
examples of Singaporean examples of that.
Yeah.
Rather than taking examples from some culture that doesn't belong to you, that have no local relevance. I think it's important that we have our own.
Contested histories. Yeah.
What you said adds to the ongoing dialogue that's in Singapore today. That we hope that everybody's going to be questioning, as opposed to just accepting like what's in the history books.
Yeah,
Because what you said,
I
reinforced.
suppose, yeah, but at the same time, not being such a defeatist rebel rouser without understanding.
Yeah. No, defeatist rebel rouser. No, I don't
A
think there are too many of those
fatalistic
around.
rebel rouser, of which I see so much of, which really troubles me as well.
Oh, okay.
You're wrong, and you're wrong, and
Oh.
and without actually being a bit more considered in the antagonism almost to the status quo.
On that note,
Thank you.
thank you so much, Pimpin, for helping us understand this film a bit more
Were
closely.
you doing the Q&A for Sandcastle as well?
No,
No.
I did the Q&A.
Mohan did. Yeah. Why?
No, I'm just wondering whether there was you see an echo.
For sure, see an echo in terms of this idea of raising questions, struggling with information, not taking everything for granted, looking at what are the frames through which we process information.
You must now go and see that film as well. You still on holiday.
I'm starring it, so you have to see it.
That definitely must be. Okay, well, thanks so much, Pimpin, and thanks everybody.